What would you do if the father who loved you most had, in secret, bought you a home you were never told about, only for you to find it years later, after his death, after your exile, after the family who once called you daughter had turned you out into the wet road with a single trunk and no name to speak of? Grace Reed was 21 when she refused a marriage meant to save another man's fortune, and for that refusal, she was cast out of the only house she had ever known. But what she found waiting in the hills above Ash Creek would, in time, rewrite everything she thought her father had left unsaid. Stay close, settle in. Let us know where you're watching from tonight, and walk this quiet road with her a little while. The coach set her down at the far end of a lane she did not know, where the hedgerows leaned close, and the light was already thinning into a slow gray drizzle. Grace stood with her small brown trunk at her boots and watched the horses turn and go, their harness bells growing thin, then thinner, then nothing at all. A crow called once from the elms. The air smelled of wet moss and coal smoke drifting from some farmhouse she could not see. She had cried the whole first day out of the city, quietly, without moving her face. She had not cried since. There was, she had discovered, an end even to grief, and beyond it, a colder country, where a person simply walked. Her mother's last words to her had been, "You bring shame on this house." Her stepbrother had counted the coins in her purse before handing it back. The gentleman she had been meant to marry, a widower of 43, with a colliery interest and 3 grown sons, had watched her from the drawing-room window as she left, his mouth flat, his hands behind him. None of them had come to the door. Only Bessie, the old cook, had pressed a folded paper into Grace's hand at the gate. "Your father's," she had murmured. "He said keep it back for her. Keep it back, until she needs it." Then Bessie had turned inside, and not looked again. Grace lifted the trunk now, and began to walk. Ash Creek lay somewhere beyond the next rise, a name she had heard only twice in her life, once on her father's lips before he died 2 winters ago, and once again in the solicitor's dry recitation of properties the family did not intend to claim. She did not know why he had chosen it. She did not yet know he had chosen anything at all. The lane climbed. Her boots, mended twice at the heel, took on the mud like old friends taking on a burden. Somewhere above her, the sky thickened toward evening, and a single low bell tolled in a valley she could not place. By the time she reached the village, it was near dark, and the windows of the low stone cottages had begun to bloom yellow, one by one. A public house stood at the crossroads, with a painted sign she could not read in the wet light. 2 men stopped their talk to watch her cross the square. A woman with a basket lowered her chin and moved past without a word. Grace kept walking until she found the door she was told to find, and knocked with a hand that had gone white at the knuckles from the cold. The solicitor's clerk who opened it looked at her, then at the paper she offered, and stepped back to let her in. He read the folded paper twice. He was a lean, tired man, in a coat gone shiny at the elbows, and he had the careful courtesy of a person who dealt often with the disappointed. He set the paper on the desk and touched it flat with 2 fingers, as if it might otherwise lift and fly. "Read," he said. "You are the daughter." "I am," Grace said. He rose, unlocked a low cupboard, and drew out a second paper, older, its seal cracked and its ink softened at the folds. He read it in silence a long while, then he cleared his throat. "There is a cottage," he said, "held in your name, purchased for you 7 years ago by your father, not entered in the household books, not known, so far as this office is aware, to your mother, nor to any other party." Grace did not move. Somewhere behind her ribs, a small warm thing turned over and lay still. "Where?" she said. Half a mile above the village, a track off the north lane. The property is, he hesitated, choosing the word, neglected. It has stood empty 6 years. There was a caretaker at first. He died. No one was sent after him. He named the price her father had paid. It was not large. He watched her face for the disappointment he expected. He did not find it. At the public house that night, she took a room the size of a cupboard and slept in her coat, and the innkeeper's wife, learning where she meant to go in the morning, laughed once, out loud, into her apron. "That heap," the woman said, half to Grace, half to the empty room. "He bought her that heap." Well, some fathers love strangely. She set the candle down harder than she needed to, and left. Word had already begun to travel. By breakfast, a small knot of men at the taproom knew her name, and knew what she had come for, and knew what they thought of it. One of them, a broad man in a good coat, looked her over as she passed, and said, loud enough to carry, "A ruin for a ruined girl. Fair trade." The others laughed. Grace did not turn her head. She paid for her tea, and she went out into the morning with her trunk. What did her father see, in a place the village called a heap? Why would a man of careful accounts hide a cottage in his daughter's name, and tell no one, not even her? And what was waiting in those damp walls that had been kept from her for 7 long years? If this quiet story has already caught you, leave a word below and follow along. The road up to the cottage is still ahead of her, and what she finds inside will begin to answer everything. The morning above Ash Creek was the color of wet slate. A thin mist hung between the cottages and did not lift. Grace crossed the square with her trunk against her hip and felt eyes on her. From doorways she could not see. A boy stopped mid-errand to stare. A woman shaking a mat out over a step paused with the mat still lifted and watched Grace pass, and only afterward finished the shake. 2 girls at a pump giggled behind their hands, and one of them, braver than the other, said something into her cupped palm that made her friend go pink. Grace did not slow. She had learned already that a straight back was the cheapest coat a girl could wear. The broad man in the good coat came out of the public house behind her and stood in the doorway to see her off, as though he had bought a ticket. He was called, she would learn later, Mr. Harding, and he owned a good part of the lower fields, and 2 barns, and the tannery pit at the end of the lane, and he did not like a woman he had not been introduced to, walking through his village with her chin held level. He drew on his pipe and spoke again, not to her, but past her, so that the men behind him would hear. 7 years the roof has sat open, he said. A fine dowry, a fine gift from a fond papa. The men behind him laughed, as men laugh who have been given permission. Someone said the word heap again, softly, and someone else said dowry, and the word ran out into the square and settled there like a coin dropped in a puddle. Grace kept walking. She had made a small rule for herself on the coach out of the city, and the rule was that she would answer nothing anyone said about her father until she knew what her father had meant. She kept the rule now. Past the last of the cottages, the road narrowed and climbed. The hedgerows were high and unkempt and beaded with damp. A crow rose out of them and flapped away with a hoarse complaint. At the fork where the north lane began, an old woman was standing at a low gate with her hand on the latch, as though she had been waiting there for some time and would wait longer if she had to. She wore a black bonnet, gone rust at the crown, and a shawl the color of moss. Her face was creased so deeply, the creases had creases. She lifted her head when Grace came level with her and studied her without hurry. "Reed's girl," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Grace said. The old woman nodded once, as if a matter had been settled that had waited a long while for settling. She looked past Grace, toward the climbing lane, and then back to Grace's face, and she said, in the same flat, considering voice. "He did not buy you a house, child. He bought you a door. Mind you find what is behind it." Grace opened her mouth and closed it. The words felt as if they had been left on a shelf for her a long time, and only just now taken down. She did not know how to answer them. She said, "Thank you," because she had been taught to, and the old woman only closed the gate latch with a small dry click, and turned, and walked back up her own path, without another word. Grace stood a moment on the lane, with her trunk beside her boot. Then, she took up the trunk again, and went on. The track off the north lane was easy to miss. Grass had grown high in the ruts. A wooden post at the turn had rotted at its base, and leaned toward the hedge, and the letters cut into it were furred with lichen, and could no longer be read. Grace turned in. The trees closed over her, almost at once. Thin ashes, and a few old thorns bent by winters of wind, and the light went green and low. The trunk had begun to feel heavier than it was. She set it down twice on the climb, and stood with her hands on her hips, and breathed. The cottage came into sight around a shoulder of the hill, without ceremony. It sat low and square in a clearing that had almost stopped being a clearing. Brambles had climbed the east wall to the eaves. The thatch had gone black in patches, and slumped in one long dip above the door, as though the roof had exhaled and forgotten to draw breath again. A shutter hung by one hinge, and moved a little in a wind Grace could not feel. The chimney was there. The chimney, at least, was upright. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment. She had told herself on the coach that she would not weep at the sight of it, whatever it was, and she did not weep now, though something in her chest sat down heavily and did not get up. The door was not locked. The clerk had told her that. He had said the key was gone, and no one had thought it worth replacing. She pushed the door with the flat of her hand, and it gave with a soft complaint of swollen wood. Inside was cold and dim, and smelled of mice and old smoke, and the particular wet green smell of a place that had been left to the weather too long. A table stood in the middle of the room with a tin cup on it, upside down, as though a man had drunk from it, and set it there, and gone out, and never come back. Grace supposed that was more or less what had happened. She stood in the doorway a long while. She counted the room. One hearth, one table, one chair broken at the back and mended with wire. A settle along the far wall under a shuttered window. A ladder in the corner, going up into a loft she could not see into from where she stood. A door in the back wall, latched, leading somewhere she did not yet know. She did not go up the ladder. She did not open the back door. She set her trunk down inside the threshold, and she sat on it, and she looked at the room until the light in the doorway had moved a full hand's breadth along the floor. She did not light a fire that night. She did not trust the chimney yet. She wrapped herself in her coat, and in a wool blanket she had folded at the top of her trunk, and she lay down on the settle, which was harder than the floor would have been, and drier, and she listened. The cottage spoke in small sounds, a drip somewhere in the loft, spaced far apart, a creak from a beam settling in the cold, something small moving in the thatch, a wind that rose once late in the night, and pressed the door in its frame, and went away again. Grace lay with her eyes open in the dark, and thought of the old woman at the gate, and of the word door, and of what her father, who had been a careful man of careful accounts, could possibly have meant by buying a girl a door. Grace woke to a thin gray light coming in at the shutter's edge, and for the space of a breath she did not know where she was. Then she remembered, and the cottage came back to her in the order she had left it. The hearth, the table, the tin cup, the ladder, the latched back door. She sat up on the settle, and the blanket slid to the floor, and something that had been under the settle moved. Grace held still. Whatever it was moved again, low and slow, And then a cat came out into the middle of the floor and sat down in the dust and looked at her. He was thin and gray, and one of his ears was notched. He was not a young cat. He did not run when she stood up. He watched her cross to the door and open it, and he watched her come back, and when she sat again on the settle, he walked over and pressed his side against her boot and stayed there. "You live here," Grace said. The cat did not answer, which was answer enough. She got up after a time and went slowly around the room in the new light. The dust on the table was thick, and there were no tracks in it but a cat's. The tin cup was tarnished green at the rim. She lifted the chair and set it upright, and it held. She knelt at the hearth and looked up the chimney and saw a small round of sky at the top of it, which was a good sign, and a great deal of soot on the sides, which was not. She went to the shuttered window and eased the shutter open, and the light widened. It was when the light widened that she saw the floor. Most of the boards were dark oak, old, uneven, worn smooth in the traffic patterns of a life. But one board, laid crosswise near the hearth, was paler than the rest, and its grain ran the wrong way. Grace bent and looked at it. Its edges were clean. There were small bright marks along one end, as though a blade had been slid under it and worked at it, and not so long ago that the wood had darkened again. She did not lift it. She stood up and put her hands in her apron pockets and looked away from it, because she had lived enough of her life in a house where notice was punished to know that a thing looked at too hard is a thing given up. She walked instead to the mantel and ran her hand along its underside where the soot had never reached. Her fingertips found a shallow line, then another, then the corner of a mark cut into the wood. She did not stoop to see it. She let her hand fall. The cat had followed her and was sitting on the hearthstone, with his tail curled around his feet. Grace looked at him, and he looked back and blinked once, slowly. "Not yet," she said, to him or to the board or to the mark under the mantel, and she went out to see what the day showed of the rest of the place, and left the inside of the cottage to keep its small secrets one more hour. Outside, the clearing was smaller than it had felt at dusk. Brambles had grown across what must once have been a path to the back of the cottage. A well stood 20 paces from the door, with its cover half rotted through. Beyond the well the ground rose in a low bank, and against the bank leaned what remained of a lean-to shed, its roof fallen in on itself. Grace walked the full round of the cottage. She counted 3 shutters gone entirely, and 2 hanging. She counted the patches in the thatch. She found, at the back wall, the outside of the latched inner door, a low door, set deep in stone, its wood grayed, its hinges black with rust, and she found that the ground before it had been trodden bare in a half-circle, as though something had stood there and turned, more than once, before the years had grown over the rest. She went back inside and began. She began with what would not wait. She swept. She swept the floor from the far wall to the door, and then again from the door to the hearth, and the dust came up in clouds that caught in her throat and hung in the light. The cat watched from the settle. When she had swept, she scrubbed. She fetched water from the well in a bucket she found upside down in the lean-to, and she boiled it in a pot she found blackened in the hearth, once she had cleaned the hearth enough to trust a small fire in it, and she scrubbed the table until the grain came up brown and honest under her hand. Her palms reddened and then blistered, and then went hard. By the second day her back ached in a place she had not known could ache. By the third, she had learned the trick of the swollen door, and the trick of the shutter hinge, and the trick of the chimney, which drew well, once she had cleared it, with a bundle of hazel switches tied to the end of the rake. She lit her first fire on the 3rd night, small and cautious, and the room smelled of wood smoke instead of mice, and the cat slept on the hearthstone, with his notched ear turned toward her. The clues came as her hands worked. She found, under a shelf she took down to clean, a nail driven crooked, as though to mark it, and behind the shelf, a patch of plaster smoother than the wall around it. She found, when she carried out the broken chair to see if she could mend its back, that its underside had been carved with a small, careful R, no larger than a thumbnail, tucked where no one sitting in it would ever see. She found, on the sill of the shuttered window, a line of tiny holes in the wood, evenly spaced, as if something had once been pinned there and taken down. She noted each of these, and did none of them. She went on scrubbing. She went on mending. She patched the worst of the thatch with reeds she cut at the edge of the clearing, and hoisted up on the ladder from the loft. She washed her one spare dress in the boiled water, and hung it on a line she strung between the door and a nail in the lean-to post. The cat followed her from room to room, from clearing to cottage and back, and slept where her feet went, and pressed against her boot in the evenings when she sat with her tea. Her hands were learning the cottage before her mind had understood it. She could feel that. The house was telling her, board by board and mark by mark, that it had been made ready for something. She did not yet know what. She only knew, at the end of each long day, that she was not living in a ruin. She was living in a room a careful man had prepared and closed and left, and the closing of it had been done with the same care as the preparing. On the 7th morning, she lifted the board. She had known she would when she woke, in the way a person knows the weather without going to the window. She fed the fire. She drank her tea. She set the tin cup on the mantel and knelt beside the hearth with a thin iron bar she had found in the lean-to. The cat came and sat at the edge of the hearthstone and watched her hands. The board rose without splintering. Beneath it lay a square of oiled cloth, folded twice, tied in twine gone stiff with age. Beneath the cloth lay a small tin box, no larger than a Bible, painted once dark green and now spotted with rust at the corners. Grace lifted the box out and set it on the swept floor, and did not open it. She sat back on her heels. The cat pressed its shoulder against her knee. She opened the box slowly. Light from the window moved across the lid as she turned it, and then across her hands, and then across what lay inside. First she saw paper, then she saw more paper. Then she saw, folded in a linen wrap beneath the papers, a small ring of iron keys, 5 of them, oiled and clean. The first paper was a deed. The cottage and the 6 acres about it were held in her name, Grace Reed, spinster, of the parish, purchased outright in the 7th year past, no encumbrance, no lien, no mortgage. Her father's signature sat at the bottom, and beside it, a second signature she did not know, and beside that, the seal of the district office pressed into red wax gone brown. The second paper was a banknote of deposit at a country bank 2 towns off, held in her name, drawn against her father's private account, and not the household's, in a sum she read twice before she believed it. It was not a fortune, it was enough. Enough for a roof and a stove and a winter's coal, and a year in which to think. The third paper was a letter. She knew his hand before she read a word. The letter was dated in the last autumn of his life, months before the cough took him. It was not long, he wrote, that he had watched her from her childhood, and had seen in her a stubbornness he loved and feared for, because the house they lived in would sell her for its own comfort the moment it could. He wrote that he had bought her a place they would not know of, in a district they would not follow her into, and that he had done it in her name, because a name written on a deed could not be taken back by any word said in any drawing room. He wrote that he did not know when she would need it. He wrote that he hoped she would not. He wrote that if she was reading this, she had been braver than he had dared ask. He wrote, at the end, live in it. Do not sell it. It is a door, Grace, not a house. She sat on the swept floor, with the letter in her lap, and the cat against her knee, and did not weep, because weeping would have been smaller than what she felt. The fire settled in the hearth. The light moved on. She read the letter again, and then a third time, and then folded it back along its old creases, and put it in the pocket of her dress, where her hand could find it without looking. The keys she laid out in a row on the hearthstone. She did not yet try the latched back door. The storm came 4 nights later. It rose out of the west after supper, low at first, a hum in the chimney, then a long, steady press of wind against the shutters, then rain in sheets that struck the thatch and ran down the walls in dark lines. Grace banked the fire and set the pot to catch the drip under the loft, and sat with the cat on the settle and listened. She had known storms in the city. She had not known this kind, where the whole hill above the cottage seemed to lean. Near midnight, over the wind, she heard a sound that was not the wind. A knock, not a branch, a hand. She opened the door with the poker in her other hand. A woman stood on the threshold in a soaked shawl, with a child in her arms, a boy no more than 4, his face white, and his lips gone blue at the edges. The woman said, "Please." That was all. Grace pulled them both inside and shut the door against the wind, and did not ask a question until the child was on the settle beside the fire, wrapped in her own blanket, and the woman was sitting on the mended chair with her hands around a cup of hot water. The woman was a tenant from a farm on the far side of the hill. The roof of their cot had gone in the wind. Her husband had stayed with the animals. She had walked with the boy over the ridge, because Grace's chimney had been the only smoke she could see. Fed the fire until the room was warm through. She stripped the child's wet clothes and dressed him in her spare dress, cut short at the hem, with the shears from her trunk. She heated broth from the little she had. She sat on the floor beside the settle, with her hand on the boy's small foot under the blanket, and watched his color come back. The cat lay along the length of him and did not move all night. Toward dawn, the woman slept in the chair with her head on her arm on the table, and the boy slept, and the storm slackened, and Grace sat awake by the fire with her father's letter in her pocket, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like a spoken sentence, that the door he had bought her was not for her only. It was for whoever came to it in the dark. She had read the letter as an inheritance. It was an instruction. At first light, she went out into the wet clearing and looked at the cottage from the outside. 2 more shingles of the patched thatch had held. The chimney stood. The shutters had held. She went back in and stoked the fire and set water to boil for the woman's waking, and thought, without saying it aloud, that she would not sell it, and she would not leave it, and she would spend whatever the banknote held on the roof before she spent a shilling of it on herself. She did not know yet how she would live afterward. She only knew that she would. When the woman woke and tried to thank her, Grace shook her head once and said, "Sit, eat." The woman ate. The boy ate. The cat sat on the hearthstone, with its notched ear turned toward the door, listening for the next thing that would come up the track. The next thing that came up the track was the woman's husband, 3 days later, in a borrowed cart with a borrowed horse. He was a lean man, with wet hair combed flat, and his hat in his hand. He stood in the clearing, and would not step to the door until Grace came out to him. He said, "You kept them." Grace said, "They kept themselves." He looked at the roof and the shutters, and the stone, and then at Grace, and said, "I have a brother who thatches." Grace said, "I have a roof that needs it." He nodded once, and did not speak again, and helped his wife into the cart, and lifted the boy, and set him on his mother's lap, under a dry blanket he had brought, folded under his arm. The brother came the following week, with 2 other men, and a load of reeds tied in the cart. They would not take coin. They took bread and tea and a place by the fire at noon, and they worked from first light to last light for 4 days. And when they climbed down from the ladder on the 4th evening, the roof was whole, and the ridgeline ran straight, and the thatch was pale and clean against the dark stone. Word of the work moved down the hill before the men did. By the end of that week, a woman Grace did not know came up the track with a hen under her arm, and set it down in the clearing, and said, "For the boy you warmed." A man came with a pane of glass wrapped in sacking, for the shuttered window. A girl came with a jar of honey, and would not give her name. Grace took each thing, and thanked each giver, by the name they offered, and wrote nothing down, because she did not need to. The clerk from the solicitor's office climbed the track on a Tuesday, in a coat still shiny at the elbows, and sat at the scrubbed table, and laid out the papers Grace had brought down to him the week before. He read the deed aloud in a low, even voice. He read the banknote. He read the letter, and at the end of the letter, he folded it and pushed it back across the table with both hands, as a man returns a thing he has been briefly honored to hold. He said, "It is all as he wrote it. The title is clean. The deposit is yours." He looked at the room, at the swept hearth and the mended chair, and the cat on the settle, and he said, he knew what he was doing. Grace said, "Yes." The clerk drank his tea and went back down the hill. Mr. Harding came last. He came on foot, without his good coat, on a bright cold morning, and stood at the edge of the clearing, until Grace looked up from the well. He said, "I said a thing in the tap room." Grace waited. He said, "I said it wrong." He looked at the roof, and at the door, and at the pale board by the hearth, visible through the open doorway, and he took off his hat, and held it against his chest, and said, "Your father was a careful man." Grace said, "He was." Mr. Harding put his hat back on, and walked down the track, and the villagers who saw him pass did not laugh, and the word heap was not spoken in the public house again. The old woman in the black bonnet came up the track once more, at the end of the month, and stood at the gate Grace had mended with new wood, and looked at the cottage, and did not come in. She said, "You found it then?" Grace said, "I found it." The old woman nodded, and turned, and walked back down toward the village, and Grace watched her until the trees closed over the shawl, the color of moss. By the end of the season, the cottage above Ash Creek had a whole roof, 4 sound shutters, a glazed window that held the morning light, a mended well cover, a lean-to rebuilt with new posts, and a small garden turned and planted in the strip of ground where the brambles had been. The tenant's wife came up once a week with the boy, who was no longer white at the lips, and the boy fed the hen, and chased the cat, and did not chase the cat, according to what the cat allowed. The banknote had been drawn against twice, once for the reeds, and once for the glass, and much of it remained. Grace kept the letter folded in the pocket of her dress, and touched it sometimes, when she was working, and did not take it out. On an evening in the late part of the year, the light in the clearing turned the color of weak honey, and lay along the pale new thatch, and against the stone of the west wall. Grace sat on the bench the tenant's husband had built for her, beside the door, with the cat pressed against her boot, and a cup of tea cooling in her hand. Smoke rose straight from the chimney. Somewhere below, in the village, a bell rang the hour and stopped. The bramble that had climbed to the eaves was gone. The shutter that had hung by one hinge hung on 2, painted the soft, dull green of the tin box she had lifted from the floor. The tenant's wife had asked her that afternoon, standing in the doorway with the boy on her hip, what she would call the place, whether it had a name to be painted on the gate. Grace had thought about it while she rinsed the cups, and while she swept the step, and while she walked the woman down as far as the fork in the lane. Now, sitting on the bench with the light going, she said the answer aloud to the cat, and to the stone, and to no one else. It is not a house. It is a door, and I am the one who opens it. She drank her tea. The cat pressed harder against her boot. A last piece of sun caught the ridge of the roof and slid off into the trees, and the clearing went blue, and the chimney kept its thin, straight thread of smoke against the darkening sky. Inside, the fire was banked, and the table was set for one, and the 5 iron keys lay in a row on the mantel where she had left them, and the letter was folded in her pocket, and the door stood a little open to the cool evening, in case anyone was coming up the track. Thank you for staying with Grace to the end of this quiet road, for sitting by her hearth, for trusting a story about a girl, a father's careful love, and a door that opened both ways. If this one warmed you, leave a kind word below, share where you're watching from, and follow along. The next cottage lamp is already lit, and another traveler is walking toward it.